Cool, thank you very much. Hi everyone, my name's Gabriel Currie, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to prepare for a cybersecurity incident. So first of all, just a super quick introduction. So as mentioned, I work for the UK government's Cabinet Office, where I lead the cyber defence team. We're responsible for threat intelligence, threat detection, incident response, and a couple of other things for the kind of internal infrastructure of the Cabinet Office and our citizen-facing infrastructure like GovUK, Notify, Pay, all of the kind of central government services that things like the Government Digital Service provide. Previously, I worked for PwC doing incident management, and over my time in security, I've worked on building security operations capabilities in government, protecting organizations from and helping them to respond to human-operated ransomware attacks. I was also part of the team that led the investigation into APT10's targeting of managed IT service providers called CloudHopper, and I run ransomwareresponse.org. So today I'm going to be talking about cyber incidents, as I said, and how you can prepare for them. So first of all, just to kind of set the scene, obviously I think we'll all be pretty familiar with cybersecurity incidents as a concept, and it's all over the press at the minute. And so every single organization out there will experience a cybersecurity incident kind of almost every day, depending on what you particularly define the term as. And they're kind of becoming more frequent, more sophisticated, and having higher impact. And alongside all of that, there's a lot of increasing expectations about how organizations respond to those incidents. That might be expectations from the public, who are now kind of quite aware of what organizations should be doing and shouldn't be doing after a response, and will kind of happily take you to task on Twitter for what they perceive to be a poor response, to things like the regulator. So the ICO has obviously got the GDPR and can take quite punitive enforcement action against organizations who don't do this well. So BA being fined 20 million for their handling of the data breach they had in 2018, and the kind of underlying causes for that is perhaps the most notable example. So I suppose with all of this, right, that just means it's really important to be ready to respond as and when this happens. So I reckon that there's 5 things that every organization needs to do in order to effectively prepare. So it's having documented processes, having the right people who've got the right skills and experience, having logs in place to enable the investigation, having containment and eradication technology to help you actually manage the risk, and coordination technology that's going to help you to manage the response to that incident. And over the next kind of 20, 25 minutes, I'm going to go through each of those and tell you a little bit more about what I think that means for the things that you actually need to do. So first of all, talking about arguably the coolest and sexiest of all of the things in cybersecurity, processes. So I think there are 3 types of processes that any incident response team needs to make sure that they've got down. So the first of those is an incident response plan. So it's just an overarching document that tells the team or the organization that is responsible for that plan what they need to do in the event of a cybersecurity incident. Now, that plan shouldn't exist in isolation, and that needs to work with all of the other stuff that exists in that organization. So that might be a crisis management framework, it might be a IT incident response plan, it might be all kinds of kind of other policies and governance. It can't exist in isolation, and it needs to work with those. Then sitting underneath that, there are technical runbooks. So things that actually tell you what to do in the event of a specific incident scenario. And that will sit underneath your incident response plan and kind of go into more detail. So your incident response plan might tell you that when you're dealing with an incident, you need to categorize and prioritize your incident. And then a technical runbook will be specific to a scenario, like a malware outbreak, and it will tell you how to do that in the event of that particular scenario. So it will help you by saying, okay, well, when you do categorize the incident, this is what your category probably is. If you do prioritize the incident, these are the things that you want to consider. So, how many endpoints is that piece of malware infected? What type of malware is it? What do we see the attacker doing with that malware? Kind of helping you to actually apply that incident response plan in that scenario. And lots of organizations do runbooks or playbooks, whatever you want to call them, in different ways. So in some organizations, you'll see that they have a specific runbook for every single detection use case that their SOC has that tells the analyst exactly what to do. Or in other organizations, you might just have like 5 or 10 different overarching runbooks that kind of provide general guidance. And when that's the case, when you don't have kind of all the documentation in the world, you need to decide what you're going to document. And generally, that's going to be decided based on risk. So either the highest impact incidents that you're most worried about to ensure that when something really bad happens, your team has got a process that they can follow that's telling them what to do, or the really likely things that they're going to be dealing with day in, day out, making sure they're doing the right things. And then finally, sitting underneath that, you've got knowledge articles. So that's detailed guidance for completing specific tasks. And those tasks will underpin the actual things that the team is going to need to do in one or more different incident response scenarios. And while all of the other things that we talked about might be quite controlled and governed and might go through lots of levels of review, knowledge articles are typically just a wiki, right? That everyone in the team can contribute to, and, people can spin up a new article or kind of change things if things aren't particularly working. And that might be something like, how to analyze an IP address, or how to review a alert firing in the antivirus provider, whatever. And that will help to enable the response to lots of different runbook scenarios potentially. So this is what it looks like, right? So you've got your incident response plan at the top, then hanging off the bottom of that, you've got all of your different runbooks, however many you decide, and those all feed into the incident response plan. And then you've got lots of knowledge-based articles that all sit under that, which support one or more runbooks. So that's it for processes. Now thinking about people. So when you're resourcing an incident response function, so when you're thinking about who's actually going to be in that function, there are a couple of different models that you can choose. And that's essentially determined by how big your organization is, what the risk is, and how much money you've got. And so at the kind of the far end of the spectrum, you might have a dedicated internal incident response team whose job it is to respond to incidents and help do incident response related stuff all the time. In the middle, you might have a virtual incident response team. So there might be a smaller organization. You don't have enough incidents, or you don't have enough budget to justify having someone on incident response all the time. But you know who the team is that's going to be formed in the event of there being an incident. So it might be your kind of head of cybersecurity and a SOC analyst or a threat intelligence analyst that can come together and form that incident response function if you need it. And then you might not even have an incident response function internally at all. You can outsource that, and there's loads of different ways you can do that. So you might have an MSSP, and you could just hand over your incident response function to them. I think a lot of organizations are moving away from that model at the minute, because especially when you're doing real hands-on incident response, it requires quite an in-depth knowledge of your environment. Or indeed, if you're really, really small, you might just have that kind of expertise on retainer. Now, there are lots of different things to think about once you've decided your resourcing model. And if you're insourcing it, then you might want to think about the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that you want that team to have. So what do you actually want them to know and be able to do? And then you can take those things and you can think about how that turns into actual roles that they're going to do. So what's their job going to be? And in job descriptions that you can recruit, against. And then once you've got those people into the organization, what's the framework that you can give them for learning and development so that their careers can actually progress? And even if you're outsourcing, you're going to want to think about some of those same things as well. So you want to be able to give your supplier requirements for the kind of knowledge and skills that you're going to want available to you as and when you call for it. And some of it also, you might just want to ensure that your provider's thinking about it so that the service that they deliver to you is effective. And a lot of the resources available to help you do this already exist. So in the Cabinet Office, for example, we use the Government Security Career Framework that gives us loads and loads of information about the specific roles that the government thinks exist within security, both within cybersecurity and also kind of wider things, and then says, what are the kind of key skills and behaviors we'd expect each of those roles to be able to do, say, an incident handler against all of the different levels and grades that we have, and what does the training pathway look like? And you can just take that and you can use that and you can apply it to your organization and tweak as needed. And there's loads of other frameworks out there that you can use to help you do that kind of thing. So NIST from the US government has got another one that goes into huge amounts of detail. The Australian Signals Directorate has got another one which is kind of quite high level. And then the Skills Framework for the Information Age is one that's kind of not aligned to any particular government, is a not-for-profit organization that does that. And so those are things that you can use to help you define and structure the progression and the training for those people. So now moving on to talk about logs. I think there's basically two questions when we're thinking about logs. What logs do we actually want to store, and how long do we want to store them for? So first of all, thinking about what logs we're going to store. So we need to come up with actual logging requirements for those systems that we're protecting to tell them to generate them and send them to the SIEM that we're then going to store. I think in my mind, there's three things that we want to think about there. That's the real world threat. So what is the attacker actually likely to be doing or trying to do in my environment? And so kind of taking those kind of threat models and then actually applying them. So using things like threat intelligence and threat modeling to work that out. Then what are the investigative questions that we're going to have in the event of an incident? So once I've found out that there's an incident on my environment, what do I actually want to know about what the attacker has done or maybe hasn't done on that environment? And that can drive what specific logs I want. Then also there's probably going to be external requirements of some form. And that's going to help shape what logs you want and also maybe what logs you don't want. So for example, the GDPR talks about the need to minimize the amount of personal data or have a kind of reason for holding personal data. So for example, if there's logs with huge amounts of personal data in them and they don't really have a huge amount of security benefit, then maybe let's not keep them. Or we might have regulation that tells us what we must capture. So, for example, if you're handling payment card data, then PCI DSS might tell you exactly what logs they need you to store. There might also be internal policies that you need to think about as well. And then how long are you going to store those logs for? So coming up with a retention period. You obviously don't want to keep those logs indefinitely, so kind of go back to things like the GDPR and also cost. So I think there's three things here. One is real-world threat, and also the capability that we have to detect those threats. The investigative requirements, so pretty much similar as last time. And then also the cost that that we're going to incur by virtue of having those logs. So when we were doing this internally, we had a look at Mandiant's M-Trends report. And so that talked about the kind of dwell time for an attack. So how long it takes for an attacker to get into the environment versus people detecting it. And they found that for non-ransomware attacks, the average dwell time was 45 days. And 25% of non-ransomware attacks had a dwell time of over 200 days. So if we say that that we're going to store logs for 14 days, but most attacks are only found after 45 days, then that's not a whole load of use. So we can use that to try and drive our logging requirements and also to justify it. You can also use, of course, data from your own internal systems for that as well, in your own internal cases. So yeah, if incidents are going to be investigated that occurred 45 or 200 days ago, then the logs should be available to enable that. But you also need to balance that against business pressures, right? Because, storage isn't necessarily free. And you can think about ways to try and reduce that cost. So it might be that some logs have greater security benefit than others. So you might want to store some logs for a short amount of time because they have a lot of value, but they're very verbose. But other logs aren't that verbose and incredibly useful. And so you might keep them for, say, a year. Or you might think about moving things into cold storage. And then if you do that, there's a lot of things to think about as well. So how do you transition them over? How do you make sure that you delete them out of cold storage in the right time, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the two questions I see around logs. Now talking about containment and eradication. So I think there's probably three different types of containment and eradication action that we want to take. So host-based, network-based, and identity. And I'm just going to step through some of the different actions that I think you're probably going to want to be able to take, and also some of the technology that you can put in place to enable you to do that. So first of all, thinking about host-based containment and eradication. So the kind of actions that you might want to take here are switching off systems or restarting them, isolating your host from the environment, identifying and removing files from hosts, whether that's based on a file name or a hash or something else, blocking files from executing on hosts, again, by a file name or a hash, or removing persistence mechanisms like registry keys or scheduled tasks from your environment. You're going to want to be able to do all of those things. And technology like kind of classic signature-based AV might help in some ways, but typically we'd use something like EDR or XDR to help to enable that. And there are also often tools built into operating systems that can help you do this to an extent as well, or existing management tools that exist on the infrastructure. Next, thinking about network-based containment and eradication. So kind of the two key things you're going to want to think about here. Blocking known IOCs on your external infrastructure. So stopping malware from calling home if you've got an infection on your environment, or stopping it from kind of connecting back, or the attacker from connecting in. So kind of blocking things at the perimeter. You also might want to think about how you can kind of pull the plug on all or bits of your network. I think that's especially relevant at the moment when we're seeing this huge rise in human-operated ransomware attacks, where if you see a ransomware attack impacting one area of your estate, you might want to think about isolating that area of the estate as quickly as possible so that it can't spread into other areas, especially more critical ones. And so in this way, you can use your existing security tooling, so things like firewalls, IDS, IPS. You can also use the network infrastructure that you've got in place, so you're kind of switching and routers. And then there's also the kind of good old-fashioned option of just pulling the plug on stuff. Finally, thinking about identity-based containment eradication. So the things you might want to think about doing in the event of an incident: changing account permissions, access, or privileges. So if the attackers provision themselves with unnecessary or unauthorized privileges, giving themselves a domain admin account, how can you take that away? How can you reset individual user credentials? And including both user credentials and like service accounts. And service accounts especially can be really, really hard to reset, especially when those credentials are hard-coded into applications. So making sure that you're able to do that. And then also how you can do that, but do it at scale. So I remember seeing, I think last year or the year before, a university in Germany had to reset credentials, and all the students had to turn up to the service desk, all like 45,000 of them, and had their password printed out for them and handed to them. And so that's obviously not sustainable, and that doesn't scale. So how can you make sure that you can actually reset credentials at scale? And then how can you actually disable and delete accounts if the attacker is going to provision themselves with new accounts? So lots of things to do there. And I think all of those really are going to be within your existing identity systems. So typically using Active Directory, and then any kind of additional functionality that you might want to put into that, or any scripts that you want to build in that to enable you to do those things quickly and at scale. And especially around the kind of resetting credentials, a lot of that is around like tying in with the service desk and talking to users and telling them about things and having mechanisms that you can, for example, securely tell them about their new password. So finally, coordination technology. So I think there's 4 things that we want to do here, and I think we need to be able to ensure we can do those effectively, and also ensure that we can do them in a resilient manner and in a secure manner. So, for example, if our email environment is completely compromised, are we still able to ensure that we can communicate as a team? Or if we don't have an email environment anymore, how can we ensure that we can still communicate? So after a human-operated ransomware attack, often that will take down huge amounts of internal infrastructure. So I've worked with organizations before who, in the aftermath of a human-operated ransomware attack, haven't had email, their internal phone directories have all been wiped, and so nobody knew how to get in contact with each other unless they happened to know each other's kind of personal mobiles and were all talking together on WhatsApp. And that just doesn't work. So how can you ensure you do all of these in a resilient and secure manner? So we've talked about communication, and both like synchronous and asynchronous communication within your team and also with external partners. So that might be your retained incident response partner, or could be the government if you're working with us. Tracking tasks. So how can you actually make sure that you document the things that you need to do to respond to the incident and kind of do that basic project management? So tracking the due dates of things, the level of effort that's going to be required, the status of those tasks, the kind of people who are going to be working on them and the next steps, because an incident is a project like any other, and we can't just have chaos. We need to make sure that we're all working together. Collaboration. So we might need to be collaborating on actual analysis. So there might be kind of a big spreadsheet which has exported all of the forensic artifacts from a system. How can we all work on that together? Or there might be response and documentation tasks. So we might have to write a report. How can we all do that together? And then off the back of all of that, reporting. So both within an incident and across multiple incidents, how can you capture key statistics within the incident? So how many systems are compromised? How many users are compromised? What's the state of each compromised system? Or across multiple incidents. So how many incidents have we had this year? What were the actors involved? What were their motivations? What was the impact? How long did it take us to respond, to remediate, all of that kind of things? And then output those to enable management reporting. So that's us finished. 5 things that I think you need to prepare for a cyber incident: documented processes, the right people with the right skills and experience, logs, containment and eradication technology, and coordination technology. So that's me done. Before I open the floor to questions, just to let you know, the Cabinet Office is hiring across red and blue team roles. We're a growing team working at the heart of government, doing some really cool stuff. DM me on Twitter. My DMs are open if you want to find any more information, or come and chat to me afterwards. That's me done. Any questions?
I'll show you first.
How are you going to change the appetite within government-type organisations for spending on IT, equipment, tools, cyber, rather than the other priority investment areas, and staff, and upgrading their pay?
That's a very good question and a very hard question to answer. Thank you. I think security is obviously a problem, and that is exemplified by some recent incidents which have notably impacted government. But I think the government as a whole is doing a whole load of really, really cool stuff to try and improve security and dedicating a lot of time and effort to doing that. So you've got organizations which are kind of relatively new and are kind of increasingly delivering a lot of value in terms of security. So the NCSC, I think, is really ramped up over the past couple of years and is doing some really cool stuff to engage with industry and also within government itself. Within government, we've also got what's called the Government Security Group, which sits within Cabinet Office, which is all around like actually kind of doing that hands-on securing of government and getting people to buy into security. I think that is in many ways working. I think we've got a long way to go. Difficult for me to say a huge amount more without getting fired. So hopefully that answers your question. But I think, it's about talking to people. It's getting buy-in for security, and it's about showing what happens when it perhaps doesn't go quite as we'd hope.
Hello, great talk. Regarding the containment of hosts that have been compromised and stuff like that, you mentioned kind of pulling the plug.
Yep.
That's more colloquially or literally, but obviously, what did you mean by that? Because I imagine if you actually pull the plug, you stand a chance of losing a lot of potential evidence that might exist in memory and other such kind of...
Sorry, I should clarify, not necessarily the power plug, the network plug. But yes, I think... But there might be situations, right, where you do want to pull the power plug. If, for example, you have a human-operated ransomware actor on your environment who is actively deploying ransomware, and it's a case of either you switch off a system to prevent them from accessing that any further, or the rest of your environment gets owned, and in the process of doing so you lose some evidence, then I think it's a case of weighing up the pros and cons of that particular decision. Absolutely. I think the priority has always got to be enabling the investigation. I talked in the beginning about the scrutiny that regulators are increasingly putting on the response. I think there have been a couple of instances where the ICO has criticized organizations for not taking and maintaining forensic copies of compromised systems. And so obviously you've got to kind of balance the pressures of that. But I think in my mind, it's just about being able to take a decision that's defensible. So to show that you've kind of considered the risks and rewards of you doing that particular thing and being able to justify it at a later date. I agree. There's something you need to be very careful of, but there are situations where absolutely you might want to pull the plug. If anyone's seen the scene in NCIS where Gibbs pulls the plug on the monitor, very similar thing.
Good talk. Thank you. So there is an incident. So sometimes it happens that there is an incident which we do not have a run book for, and you might always run into such kind of situations. What are the things that we can do to say that despite not having a run book, we ran through a minimum standard of that incident, essentially?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Are you able to clarify? Sorry.
So, for example, if we don't have a run book for it, what kind of other things that we can do so that the incident is handled well despite not having a run book?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So, I think runbooks are an interesting one, and processes, I think, can be, can vary in their usefulness, right? So if you're a really experienced team, then I think a documented process is just like a kind of handrail for you, right? It makes sure you're going in the right direction. But if you're a less experienced team or you're doing something that you're not experienced in, then those documented processes can be absolutely vital. And I'd go back to that hierarchy, right? So we spoke about having that incident response plan at the top. And I think in my mind, right, that's a non-negotiable. Now, it's probably unlikely that you're going to have a run book for every single instance scenario that you're ever going to come across, right? And if you do have that, it just turns into a cottage industry. And actually you end up in a situation where you either spend all of your life updating run books that you never use, or you write run books and by the time you actually come to use them, they're pointless. So I think it's having the right documentation at multiple levels. So if you don't have a run book, then your incident response plan should still be able to tell you the kind of things that you need to be doing and the questions that you should be asking. And then, so you should kind of be able to work it out, right? Alongside all of the other training that you've got. So hopefully it should still work out. Ideally, you'd want the run book though, right? Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? No. Okay, then please show our appreciation for Gabriel.